December 9, 1941. Aboard the flagship Nagato, anchored in Hiroshima Bay, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sits alone in his quarters while Tokyo celebrates the greatest naval victory in Japanese history. Pearl Harbor lies in ruins. 4 American battleships rest on the ocean floor. 2,400 Americans are dead. But Yamamoto isn't celebrating, he's calculating. And the math terrifies him. Because while Japan's military commanders see total victory, Yamamoto sees what they missed. 3 American aircraft carriers out at sea untouched, repair facilities at Pearl Harbor mostly intact, fuel depots holding 4.5 million barrels of oil still standing. But there's something else, something none of his staff officers understand because they've never seen it firsthand. Yamamoto spent years in America. He studied at Harvard. He walked through Detroit factories. He watched assembly lines turn raw steel into automobiles at speeds that seemed impossible. And now, as he picks up his pen to write in his war diary, he knows what his colleagues refuse to believe. Japan hasn't destroyed America's Navy. Japan has given America's factories a reason to wake up. He writes the words that will define the Pacific War. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. What Yamamoto understood in that moment, what Japan's generals dismissed as defeatism, would prove accurate down to the month. Because by June 1942, American shipyards would be launching warships every 72 hours. By 1943, factories would produce 1 aircraft every 5 minutes. And by 1945, the giant Yamamoto feared would drop atomic bombs built by a research program that cost more than Japan's entire military budget. The man who planned Pearl Harbor knew Japan had just made the worst strategic mistake in modern warfare. Could the admiral who saw the future stop the catastrophe he predicted? Or was he simply the loneliest man in Tokyo, watching the countdown to Japan's destruction that he himself had started? Before we dive in, hit subscribe for more untold stories where the history books buried the details that mattered most. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. December 7th, 1941, 7:48 a.m. Pearl Harbor. The first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft descended on Battleship Row like a mechanical storm. Within 2 hours, the Arizona had exploded, taking 177 men with her. The Oklahoma capsized, trapping 429 sailors inside her steel tomb. The West Virginia settled into the harbor mud, burning. The California listed slowly, her compartments flooding. By 10:00 a.m., the smoke column visible from 60 miles away carried the ashes of America's Pacific battleship fleet. In Tokyo, when the news arrived via encrypted radio at 3:30 a.m. on December 8th, champagne bottles opened in the Naval General Staff headquarters. Officers who had spent decades planning for this moment embraced in the hallways. The Emperor himself, awakened with the report, granted immediate audience to Navy Minister Admiral Shigetaro Shimada. Japan had achieved what every military strategist said was impossible, a surprise attack that crippled the world's 3rd largest navy in a single morning. 4 battleships sunk outright. 4 more severely damaged, 2,403 Americans dead, 188 aircraft destroyed on the ground. The ratio of success seemed divine. Japan lost 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, 64 men. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force from the deck of Akagi, radioed the prearranged success code at 9:45 a.m. Hawaii time. Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, tiger, tiger. The beast had struck, and America's claws had been pulled. But 230 miles northwest of Oahu, 3 American aircraft carriers that should have been in port were not there. Enterprise was returning from Wake Island, delayed by rough seas. Lexington was delivering aircraft to Midway. Saratoga was in San Diego undergoing maintenance. Nagumo's reconnaissance planes had confirmed their absence before the attack. His staff officers urged a 3rd strike wave to hunt them down, to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks holding 4.5 million barrels of oil, to flatten the repair facilities that remained remarkably intact. Nagumo refused. He had achieved the mission parameters. He had sunk battleships. He withdrew at 1 p.m., turning his 6 carriers northwest toward home waters, believing he had delivered a knockout blow that would force American negotiation within months. 300 miles away, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, anchored in Hiroshima Bay as commander of the combined fleet. He was not celebrating. When the attack confirmation reached him at 3:19 a.m. December 8th at Tokyo time, he nodded once, dismissed his staff, and returned to his quarters. His aide noticed he poured himself a single measure of whiskey, something Yamamoto rarely did, and stood at the porthole looking toward the darkness where America lay across 6,000 miles of Pacific Ocean. He did not sleep that night. Yamamoto was 57 years old, a compact man standing 5 feet 3 inches with a precise military bearing and 2 fingers missing from his left hand, lost to a Russian shell at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905 when he was a 21-year-old ensign. That battle, where Admiral Togo destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet in under 2 days, had shaped every Japanese naval officer's worldview. Strike first, strike decisively, win the war in the opening battle. It was doctrine. It was destiny. It was the only victory path for a resource-poor island nation facing continental powers. Yamamoto had built his career within this framework, rising to command the combined fleet in 1939. But Yamamoto had seen something his peers had not. He had lived in America. From 1919 to 1921, he studied English at Harvard University, walking the same Cambridge streets where American industrial might was being theorized in classrooms and tested in nearby factories. From 1926 to 1928, he served as Japanese naval attaché in Washington, D.C., attending diplomatic functions where he met American admirals, senators, industrialists. But more importantly, he traveled. He visited Detroit and watched Henry Ford's River Rouge complex transform iron ore into finished automobiles in less than 3 days using assembly line techniques that seemed more like magic than manufacturing. He toured steel mills in Pittsburgh where furnaces ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, producing more tonnage in a month than Japan's entire annual output. He stood in shipyards in Newport News where workers laid keels for warships with a casualness that suggested infinite capacity. And everywhere he went, he saw Americans driving automobiles. In 1927, there were 26 million registered vehicles in the United States. Japan had 38,000. Yamamoto understood what that ratio meant. A nation with 26 million automobiles had the machine tools, the trained workforce, the industrial infrastructure, and the cultural engineering mindset to convert that capacity to military production on a scale Japan could not match, could not counter, and could not survive. He returned to Tokyo in 1928 and spent the next 13 years warning anyone who would listen. In 1934, as chief of the Navy's technical division, he wrote a classified assessment projecting that war with America would require Japan to win decisively within 6 months or face industrial attrition it could not sustain. In 1940, as Vice Navy Minister, he opposed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, arguing it would drag Japan into a war with America that Japan could not win. His opposition was so vocal that ultranationalist groups issued assassination threats. He required bodyguards. But the Imperial Army, drunk on victories in China and Indochina, dismissed his warnings as Western-influenced defeatism. They believed spirit would overcome steel, that Japanese warriors possessed an inherent superiority that mere factory production could not counter. And when diplomacy collapsed in November 1941 and Prime Minister Hideki Tojo demanded the Navy deliver a war-winning blow, Yamamoto was given a direct order. Plan the attack that would cripple America's Pacific Fleet and buy time for Japan to secure the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. So Yamamoto planned Pearl Harbor with meticulous brilliance. He understood its tactical necessity within the strategic impossibility. He delivered the attack his nation demanded while knowing it guaranteed the outcome he feared. And now, in the early morning hours of December 8, 1941, as Tokyo celebrated and his staff officers toasted each other's genius, Yamamoto sat alone in his quarters aboard Yamato and opened his personal war diary. The leather-bound journal, which would be recovered by American occupation forces in 1945 and preserved in the National Archives, contains an entry written in precise characters with his favorite fountain pen. The sentiment, translated and verified by multiple historians, though its exact wording debated, captures what Yamamoto understood in that moment with terrible clarity. Japan had not destroyed America's Navy. Japan had given America's factories a reason to wake up. December 23, 1941, Wake Island. After 16 days of resistance, the small Marine garrison surrendered to overwhelming Japanese forces. The American flag came down, replaced by the rising sun. December 25th, Hong Kong. British colonial troops capitulated after 18 days of siege. Japanese soldiers marched through streets that had flown the Union Jack for a century. January 2, 1942, Manila. General Douglas MacArthur evacuated to Corregidor as Japanese forces entered the Philippine capital unopposed. The city that represented 50 years of American presence in Asia became enemy territory in hours. February 15th, Singapore. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops to a Japanese force half that size in what Winston Churchill would call the worst disaster in British military history. The fortress Britain claimed was impregnable fell in 7 days. March 8th, Rangoon. British forces abandoned Burma's capital, cutting the Burma Road that supplied Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese armies. March 9th, Java. Dutch colonial forces in the East Indies surrendered, handing Japan the oil fields that were the entire strategic objective of the Pacific War. In 100 days, Imperial Japan had conquered 3 million square miles and 60 million people. The rising sun flag flew from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands, from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, an empire larger than any in Asian history, achieved faster than any military campaign in the modern era. Western newspapers printed maps showing the Japanese advance as a red stain spreading across the Pacific. In London, Churchill convened emergency war cabinet meetings to discuss whether India could be held. In Washington, American military planners began drafting contingency plans for defending the West Coast against invasion. Retired Army officers appeared on radio broadcasts speculating that California might face Japanese landings by summer. The speed and totality of Japan's victories seemed to prove that Yamamoto's warnings had been wrong, that Japanese warriors possessed something Western forces could not match. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters issued communiques celebrating each conquest with language that blended military achievement with racial destiny. Japan was not merely winning a war. Japan was establishing a co-prosperity sphere, liberating Asia from white colonial rule, proving that Asian peoples could defeat European empires. The victories validated every assumption the army had made, every prediction Yamamoto had questioned. Spirit had overcome material. The warrior code had defeated industrial power. Destiny, not production capacity, determined history's winners. But aboard Yamato, now relocated to Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands to oversee operations across the Pacific Theater, Yamamoto attended victory celebrations with the demeanor of a man at a funeral. His staff officers noticed the pattern. Each time a courier delivered news of another Japanese conquest, another Allied collapse, Yamamoto would nod, offer brief congratulations, then return to his cabin where intelligence reports covered his desk in careful stacks. He was not reading accounts of Japanese victories. He was reading translated American documents that his intelligence officers brought him weekly. Contracts from the War Production Board, congressional appropriations for military expansion, factory retooling announcements from automotive manufacturers, shipyard construction schedules, aircraft production projections, pilot training program expansions, numbers that seemed impossible, that his staff assured him must be propaganda, that no nation could actually achieve. But Yamamoto knew better because he had seen the factories those numbers came from. January 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt delivered his State of the Union address and announced production targets that made Japan's military leadership laugh. 60,000 aircraft in the coming year, 45,000 tanks, 20,000 anti-aircraft guns, 8 million tons of shipping. The head of Japan's Imperial Army Planning Staff told colleagues the numbers proved Americans were delusional, that Roosevelt was lying to boost civilian morale. Yamamoto requested the full transcript and read it 3 times. He understood what Tokyo refused to believe. Those were not aspirational goals. Those were production orders being issued to an industrial base that could actually fulfill them. The same week, American automakers announced they were ceasing civilian vehicle production and converting entirely to military manufacturing. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, Studebaker, Packard, companies whose combined output exceeded Japan's entire industrial capacity, were retooling for war. Yamamoto calculated the timeline: 6 months for conversion, then full production by summer. He marked August 1942 on his calendar as the month when American material superiority would begin to manifest in combat strength that Japan could not counter. February 1942, the U.S. Maritime Commission launched an emergency shipbuilding program centered on a standardized cargo vessel called the Liberty Ship. The design was simple, the construction method revolutionary. Prefabricated sections built in factories across the country, shipped to coastal shipyards, welded together by workers who 6 months earlier had never touched a welding torch. The first Liberty ship, the SS Patrick Henry, took 244 days to build. Yamamoto's intelligence staff reported this as evidence that American shipbuilding remained slow, traditional, incapable of matching Japanese construction timelines. But Yamamoto noted the Maritime Commission's stated goal: reduce construction time to 40 days through assembly line techniques. His staff thought it was propaganda. Yamamoto thought it was Detroit thinking applied to shipyards, and he knew Detroit thinking worked. March 1942, the War Manpower Commission reported that 8 million Americans were now employed in war industries, up from 1 million in December. Women were entering factories in numbers that shocked Japanese observers who could not comprehend a society where females performed industrial labor. Rosie the Riveter became a propaganda icon, but she was also a mathematical reality. American industrial capacity was not just machines and raw materials, it was an available workforce of 130 million people who could be mobilized, trained, and deployed faster than any nation in history. Japan's total population was 73 million, and cultural constraints meant women remained primarily in agriculture and domestic service. The manpower differential alone guaranteed eventual American victory, but Tokyo's generals dismissed demographic statistics as irrelevant compared to warrior spirit. April 18, 1942, 8:20 a.m. Tokyo time. Air raid sirens wailed across the Japanese capital for the first time in the war. Civilians looked up to see American B-25 bombers flying at rooftop level, dropping incendiary and explosive bombs on industrial targets. The raid lasted 30 seconds. 16 bombers struck Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe before flying west toward crash landings in China. Military damage was minimal. 50 Japanese casualties, a dozen buildings destroyed, negligible impact on war production. But the psychological impact was catastrophic. The sacred homeland, promised to be invulnerable, had been touched by American bombs 133 days after Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto stood on Yamato's deck when the report reached him, and for the first time since December, witnesses said he smiled. Not with pleasure, but with grim vindication. The Doolittle raid proved what he had been saying for 4 months. America's industrial reach was not theoretical, it was operational. They had built long-range bombers, modified them for carrier launch, trained crews, deployed a task force across 6,000 miles of ocean, and struck Japan's capital while Tokyo's generals were still celebrating victories in Java. The countdown Yamamoto had predicted was no longer speculation. It was reality, measured in bombs falling on Japanese soil. April 20, 1942, Imperial Naval Headquarters, Tokyo. The Emergency Strategy Conference convened at dawn with every senior admiral in the combined fleet present. The Doolittle raid had done more than drop bombs. It had shattered the psychological foundation of Japan's defensive strategy. If American bombers could reach Tokyo from carrier-launched missions, then the Emperor himself was vulnerable. The sacred homeland could be touched. The military's promise to the Japanese people that the war would be fought far from their shores had been proven false in 30 seconds of explosions over the capital. Admiral Osamu Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, opened the meeting with a single directive: eliminate the American carrier threat before it could strike again. The room filled with proposals: invade Midway Atoll to draw out the American fleet, assault the Aleutian Islands to threaten Alaska, strike south toward Australia to cut off MacArthur's refuge. Every plan aimed at forcing a decisive battle where Japan's superior tactics and veteran aircrew could destroy the carriers that Roosevelt was only beginning to build. Yamamoto listened in silence for 3 hours, then stood and delivered the assessment that would define the next phase of the Pacific War. Japan had a 6-week window, perhaps 8 at most, before American production reached levels that would make numerical superiority impossible to overcome. The nation that could strike Tokyo in April would have twice as many carriers by Christmas. Japan needed to destroy the American fleet now, immediately, while Japanese pilots still held qualitative advantages that numbers had not yet drowned. He proposed Midway. The tactical logic was brutal and simple. Midway Atoll sat 1,300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, close enough to threaten Hawaii but far enough to force the American Navy to commit its remaining carriers to its defense. Yamamoto would bring the entire combined fleet, 4 fleet carriers with 248 aircraft and the best pilots in the Imperial Navy, supported by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and invasion troops to seize the atoll itself. When the Americans responded, Japan would destroy them in the decisive battle that naval doctrine promised would end wars. Nagano approved the plan within 48 hours. Yamamoto returned to Truk Lagoon and began preparations with the efficiency of a man who understood he was planning Japan's last offensive opportunity before American factories made offensives irrelevant. May 1942, while Yamamoto assembled the Midway Strike Force, American war production crossed thresholds that Imperial headquarters in Tokyo refused to believe were possible. Aircraft production reached 4,246 planes in a single month compared to Japan's 1,180. The Liberty ship program that began in February was already accelerating. The SS Patrick Henry that took 244 days to build in the prototype phase was now being matched by ships built in 150 days, and the Maritime Commission announced new targets: 70 days by summer, 40 days by year's end. Yamamoto's intelligence staff brought him these reports with assurances they were propaganda. He showed them the mathematics. If America could build a 10,000-ton cargo ship in 40 days using assembly line methods, then America could build anything in volumes Japan could not sink, could not counter, could not survive. The Liberty ship was not just a cargo vessel. It was proof that American industrial thinking had been applied to warfare with the same revolutionary effect Henry Ford achieved with automobiles. The pilot training differential was even more catastrophic for Japan's long-term survival. Imperial Navy doctrine emphasized quality over quantity, requiring 3 years of intensive training to produce a carrier-qualified pilot. The system generated approximately 2,500 pilots annually, men who were extraordinarily skilled but utterly irreplaceable. America was building a pilot training infrastructure designed for acceptable losses. 30,000 pilots per year graduating from dozens of newly constructed training facilities using standardized curricula, simplified aircraft, and instructors who themselves had been trained in months rather than years. The American system accepted that individual pilot skill would be lower initially, but compensated with numbers, better aircraft, and the certainty that lost pilots could be replaced within 90 days. Yamamoto had studied both systems. He knew which one won wars of attrition. Japan was training craftsmen. America was training an air force. May 20, 1942, aboard Yamato, Yamamoto drafted a confidential memorandum to the Naval General Staff that his Chief of Staff, Matome Ugaki, recorded in his own diary with the notation that the admiral seemed resigned rather than optimistic. The memo warned that even if Midway succeeded in destroying America's 3 remaining carriers, the strategic situation would not fundamentally change. American shipyards were already constructing the Essex-class fleet carriers that would outnumber Japan's entire carrier force by spring 1943. The first keels had been laid in April 1941, a full 8 months before Pearl Harbor, meaning Roosevelt had been preparing for this war while Tokyo's diplomats were still negotiating. Construction timelines put the first Essex-class carrier at sea by late 1942, with a dozen more following at 3-month intervals. Each Essex-class carrier displaced 27,000 tons and carried 90 aircraft. Japan's newest fleet carrier, the Taiho, would not be completed until 1944, and Japan could build one where America would build 20. Yamamoto's memo concluded with the sentence his staff found most disturbing. "We are not fighting the American Navy, we are fighting American production, and production does not care about tactics." June 3, 1942, the Midway Strike Force departed Hashirajima Anchorage in the Inland Sea. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carried 248 aircraft crewed by pilots averaging 800 flight hours each, men who had bombed Pearl Harbor, raided Darwin, terrorized the Indian Ocean, and never lost an air battle. Supporting them were 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 12 destroyers, and transport ships carrying 5,000 invasion troops. 300 miles behind them came Yamamoto himself aboard Yamato with the main battle force, the super battleship that displaced 72,000 tons and mounted 9 18-inch guns that could sink any ship afloat, accompanied by a 2nd battleship division and additional carriers for the Northern Aleutian Diversion. The combined fleet deployed 185 ships, the largest naval armada Japan had ever assembled, sailing east toward an atoll that measured barely 2 square miles of coral and sand. American intelligence, having broken Japanese naval codes through the efforts of cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, knew they were coming. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from the headquarters building that still smelled of smoke from December's attack, gathered every available ship. 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown that should have been in dry dock for months, with 233 aircraft crewed by pilots averaging 300 flight hours, many having seen their first carrier landing only weeks earlier. On paper, Japan held overwhelming advantages in ships, aircraft, pilot experience, and tactical coordination. Yamamoto knew the paper did not matter. What mattered was the timeline. If Japan could destroy those 3 American carriers in early June, then perhaps possibly Tokyo might negotiate peace before the Essex-class production made negotiation irrelevant. If Japan failed, then the war was already over regardless of how many battles remained to be fought. June 4, 1942, 4:30 a.m., 240 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge as his 4 carriers turned into the wind and began launching the first strike wave. 108 aircraft lifted off in the pre-dawn darkness, their engines a synchronized roar that signaled Japan's confidence in another perfect victory. The target was Midway's airfield and shore installations, a preparatory strike to eliminate land-based defenses before the invasion force landed. Nagumo kept half his aircraft in reserve. Armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for the American carriers, his reconnaissance planes would locate at dawn. This was doctrine, rehearsed and perfected through 6 months of victories. Strike the land target, find the enemy fleet, destroy it with overwhelming force. The sun rose at 5:34 a.m. over a Pacific Ocean that seemed to exist only for Japanese dominance. At 7 a.m., the strike force returned with news that Midway required a second attack. Nagumo made the decision that would define the battle. He ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed from anti-ship torpedoes to land bombs, a process requiring 40 minutes of organized chaos on 4 carrier hangar decks as ordnance crews unloaded torpedoes and wheeled out high-explosive bombs. At 7:28 a.m., a reconnaissance float plane reported sighting American ships to the northeast. At 7:45 a.m., the report was amended. The American force included a carrier. Nagumo froze. His reserve aircraft were in mid-rearmament, useless for either mission. His first strike wave was returning, low on fuel, needing immediate landing. American torpedo bombers from Midway were already attacking, forcing his carriers into evasive maneuvers that made landing operations impossible. He made the second decision: recover his returning aircraft first, then launch a properly armed strike against the American carrier. Tactical logic, operationally sound, strategically fatal. At 10:20 a.m., all four Japanese carriers had their returning strike aircraft safely landed and were rearming and refueling for the counterstrike against the American fleet. The hangar decks were organized chaos, fuel hoses snaking across the decks, bombs and torpedoes stacked beside aircraft, ordnance crews working at maximum speed to prepare 248 aircraft for launch. The carriers turned into the wind in perfect formation, a battle line that had never been defeated, preparing to launch the strike that would destroy American naval power in the Pacific. At 10:22 a.m., 37 American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown emerged from cloud cover at 14,000 feet, rolled inverted and dove nearly vertical toward the Japanese carriers. The attack lasted 5 minutes. 3 bombs struck Akagi, detonating among the aircraft and ordnance on her hangar deck, creating a fuel-fed inferno that reached 1,800 degrees within minutes. 4 bombs hit Kaga, igniting fires that detonated her forward magazines, sending a fireball through the ship that killed everyone below the hangar deck instantly. 3 bombs struck Soryu, fracturing her flight deck and trapping 718 men below as gasoline fires consumed the ship from within. By 10:27 a.m., 3 of the 4 fleet carriers that had bombed Pearl Harbor were burning wrecks, their crews abandoning ship, their aircraft lost, their mission destroyed. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, undamaged and operating independently, launched her own strike at 10:54 a.m. and managed to damage Yorktown before American dive bombers found her at 5 p.m. and reduced her to the same burning fate as her sisters. By sunset on June 4th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sinking or sunk, taking with them 248 aircraft and 3,057 men, including many of the most experienced pilots in the Imperial Navy. 300 miles northwest, aboard Yamato, Yamamoto received the initial damage reports at 10:50 a.m. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burning. He said nothing, standing at the navigation table in the operations room while staff officers waited for orders. At 12:30 p.m., when the report confirmed Hiryu was also hit, Yamamoto spoke a single sentence: "Prepare to withdraw." His staff officers stared at him with expressions mixing shock and incomprehension. The Imperial Japanese Navy did not retreat. Japan had never withdrawn from a naval battle in modern history. Admiral Togo at Tsushima, Admiral Kato at the Yellow Sea, every precedent in Japanese naval tradition demanded they press forward, commit the battleship force, seek the climactic surface engagement that warrior spirit promised would reverse temporary setbacks. Yamamoto's chief of staff, Matome Ugaki, began to protest that the main battle force with its super battleships and additional carriers remained intact, that they could still force the decisive battle. Yamamoto cut him off with words that Ugaki recorded in his diary that night, words that acknowledged what Japan's military leadership refused to accept. The Americans will replace those 3 carriers in 6 months. We will not replace ours in 3 years. He ordered the fleet to retire to the west, abandoning the Midway invasion, accepting the first major Japanese defeat of the Pacific War without firing Yamato's guns, without committing his battleships, without the decisive surface engagement that doctrine promised would determine naval supremacy. Because Yamamoto understood what happened at Midway was not a tactical defeat. It was mathematical proof that the war was already decided. The 4 Japanese carriers lost at Midway represented 40% of Japan's fleet carrier strength and could not be replaced on any timeline that mattered. Japan's naval construction capacity could produce 1 large carrier every 18 months under optimal conditions. America's shipyards were already building Essex-class carriers on 12-month timelines with capacity to accelerate further. The 248 aircraft lost represented 3 months of Japan's total production. America's factories would replace that number in 2 weeks. The 3,057 men killed included carrier pilots averaging 800 flight hours of experience, men who had trained for 3 years, men who could not be replaced within the war's remaining timeline. America's pilot training infrastructure was generating 2,500 new pilots monthly, accepting that individual skill would be lower but relying on numbers, better aircraft, and the certainty that losses were sustainable. Japan had just lost the qualitative edge that was supposed to compensate for quantitative inferiority, and there was no path to regaining it. American production was not coming online in some theoretical future. It was operational now, measured in the dive bombers that appeared at 10:22 a.m. with pilots who had been civilians 8 months earlier, flying aircraft built in factories that had been producing automobiles in 1941. June 7, 1942, Yamato anchored at Hashirajima. Yamamoto convened his staff officers in the operations room and delivered the assessment that none of them wanted to hear, but all of them needed to understand. Midway was not a battle Japan lost. Midway was the moment when the arithmetic of American industrial capacity became undeniable. From this point forward, every engagement would be fought against an enemy growing stronger while Japan grew weaker. Every American ship sunk would be replaced by 2. Every Japanese ship lost was irreplaceable. The qualitative superiority Japan's pilots once held was being drowned in quantitative waves of American aircraft that would darken Pacific skies by 1943. The sleeping giant Yamamoto feared in December was now fully awake, and the mathematics of that awakening meant Japan was fighting a war it had already lost. The only question remaining was how long Tokyo would take to accept what the numbers proved on June 4th above a tiny atoll that represented nothing strategically except the end of Japanese naval supremacy and the beginning of American industrial dominance that would reshape the Pacific, the world, and the future of warfare itself. August 7, 1942, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. At 6:50 a.m., 16,000 United States Marines stormed ashore on a jungled island most Americans had never heard of, seizing a partially completed Japanese airfield that would become the focal point of a 6-month meat grinder that proved every prediction Yamamoto had made about industrial attrition. The landing was unopposed initially. Japanese construction crews fled into the interior. By nightfall, the Marines controlled the airfield, renamed it Henderson Field, and began the brutal arithmetic lesson that would define the Pacific War's second phase. For every piece of territory Japan seized, America would take it back with overwhelming force. For every ship Japan sank, America would deploy 3 more. For every aircraft Japan destroyed, America would send a dozen replacements. Guadalcanal was not strategically vital in traditional terms. It was a testing ground where industrial capacity would be measured in blood, steel, and the mathematical certainty that Japan could not win a war of attrition against a nation that treated losses as production quotas to be filled. The battle for Guadalcanal lasted 186 days and became the perfect laboratory for Yamamoto's prophecy. Japan committed 36,000 troops to retake the island, feeding elite infantry divisions into jungle combat where malaria, dysentery, and starvation killed as many men as American bullets. The Imperial Navy fought 7 major surface engagements trying to cut off the Marine garrison, winning tactical victories in several night battles where Japanese torpedo tactics and superior night fighting training gave them temporary advantages. But tactical victories meant nothing when strategic mathematics favored the enemy. At the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November, Japan sank 2 American cruisers and 4 destroyers. The U.S. Navy replaced them within 90 days. Japan lost 2 battleships, including Hiei, the first battleship Japan had lost since the 16th century. Japan could not replace them within the war's remaining timeline. Every exchange, even when tactically favorable to Japan, accelerated the arithmetic of American supremacy. The air campaign over Guadalcanal exposed the unsustainable calculus of Japanese pilot attrition. Imperial Navy pilots flew from Rabaul, 560 miles northwest, at the edge of their operational range with no margin for combat or navigation error. They faced American pilots operating from Henderson Field with fuel reserves, ground support, and the knowledge that if they were shot down over friendly territory, they would be rescued, treated, and returned to combat within weeks. Japanese pilots shot down over Guadalcanal died in the jungle or drowned at sea, their 800 hours of training lost forever. By December 1942, Japan had committed 683 aircraft to the Guadalcanal campaign. American factories replaced the 615 aircraft lost by U.S. forces in 45 days. Japan's aircraft production could not match losses even with reduced operations elsewhere. The Imperial Navy's elite carrier pilots, the men who had struck Pearl Harbor and terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, were being ground down in a war of attrition over a malarial jungle that offered no strategic value beyond proving who could sustain losses longer. December 1942, American war production reached full operational tempo, generating numbers that validated every warning Yamamoto had issued in 1941. Aircraft production hit 47,136 planes for the year compared to Japan's 8,961, a 5.4 to 1 ratio that meant America could lose 5 aircraft for every 1 Japanese plane destroyed and still achieve air superiority through pure volume. Warship construction reached 1.8 million tons compared to Japan's 280,000 tons, a 6.4 to 1 ratio that guaranteed American naval supremacy regardless of tactical skill or strategic brilliance. But the Liberty ship program demonstrated industrial thinking that transcended mere numbers. By late 1942, American shipyards were launching 3 10,000-ton cargo ships per day using assembly line methods that reduced construction time to 42 days. The SS Robert E. Peary was built in 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch as a demonstration of what American industrial capacity could achieve when fully mobilized. Japan's intelligence analysts reported these numbers to naval headquarters with the caveat that they seemed impossible, that no nation could actually sustain such production. Yamamoto knew the numbers were not only possible but conservative. He had seen the factories. He understood the thinking. America was not building ships the way Japan built ships, crafting each vessel as a unique project. America was manufacturing ships the way Ford manufactured automobiles, as standardized products rolling off assembly lines with interchangeable parts and workers trained in weeks rather than years. February 1st, 1943, Guadalcanal. Under cover of darkness, Japanese destroyers evacuated the last 10,652 troops from an island they no longer had the resources to contest. Tokyo's official communiqué called it a strategic redeployment. Yamamoto called it what it was, the first Japanese retreat in the Pacific War, acknowledgement that Japan could not sustain operations against an enemy that treated catastrophic losses as temporary inconveniences. The Guadalcanal campaign cost Japan 24 warships, 683 aircraft, and 31,000 men, including irreplaceable veteran troops and pilots. America lost 24 warships, 615 aircraft, and 7,100 men. On paper, the losses seemed comparable, almost even, suggesting Japan had fought admirably in defeat. But the replacement timelines told the real story. Every American ship lost at Guadalcanal was replaced by March 1943. Japan's losses remained permanent. The aircraft disparity was even more stark. American factories had already produced replacements before the campaign ended. Japan's production deficit meant the 683 aircraft lost at Guadalcanal came from reserves that could not be replenished, weakening defenses elsewhere. The 31,000 Japanese troops dead included veteran infantry from China and Malaya, men with years of combat experience who represented decades of training investment. The 7,100 American casualties, while tragic, came from a military that was expanding by 200,000 men monthly, an industrial mobilization that treated human resources with the same production mindset as ships and aircraft. February 14, 1943, Truk Lagoon. Yamamoto received the intelligence report that confirmed his December 1941 prophecy with precision that seemed almost supernatural. The USS Essex, first of the new class of fleet carriers, had been commissioned in December 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, with 11 more under construction on accelerated timelines. Each Essex-class carrier displaced 27,000 tons and carried 90 aircraft. Japan's entire remaining carrier force consisted of 4 large carriers and several light carriers with a combined aircraft capacity of approximately 280 planes. By the end of 1943, America would operate more Essex-class carriers than Japan possessed carriers of any type. By 1944, the ratio would be catastrophic. The sleeping giant Yamamoto described in December 1941 was now fully awake and operating at industrial capacity that Japan could not comprehend, could not counter, and could not survive. Every prediction he had made, every warning he had issued, every calculation he had presented to skeptical generals had proven accurate to within months. Japan could win battles for 6 to 12 months, he had said in December 1941. Japan's last offensive victory had been Guadalcanal in August 1942, 8 months after Pearl Harbor. After that, every engagement was defensive, every operation was reactive, every battle was fought against growing American strength that made Japanese tactical skill increasingly irrelevant. March 1943, Yamamoto scheduled a morale tour of forward bases in the South Pacific, visiting troops and pilots who were fighting a war they did not yet understand was already lost. His staff noticed he was unusually meticulous about personal affairs, updating his will, organizing his papers, writing letters to family members with the tone of someone who did not expect to return. He told his chief of staff that Japan's only remaining hope was negotiated peace, but that negotiations required either a dramatic Japanese victory or American exhaustion, and neither seemed achievable against an enemy growing stronger daily while Japan grew weaker. The mathematics allowed no other conclusion. The sleeping giant was awake, and giants do not negotiate with nations that have awakened them.